There is a particular kind of silence that follows a giant. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of aftermath. The kind that settles into the corners of a mansion when the cheering has long stopped and the teammates have gone home to their own lives. Walk through the sprawling estate of Shaquille O'Neal today, and you'll find something that no sports documentary ever prepared you for. You'll find a 54-year-old man eating breakfast alone at a table built for 12. You will find championship rings sitting in display, cases like museum artifacts from a civilization that no longer exists. And if you stay long enough, if the hour grows late enough, you will hear the one sound that now defines the nights of the most physically dominant athlete the modern world has ever produced. The mechanical hiss of a breathing machine keeping a legend alive. This is not the story the world rehearsed. The world rehearsed dunks that collapsed steel stanchions and a smile wide enough to fill a billboard. The world rehearsed platinum albums and blockbuster films and financial empire valued at $500 million. But the story unfolding right now in 2026 is something far more complicated and far more human than any highlight reel could contain. It is a story of what happens after Superman takes off the cape and realizes the man underneath has been gasping for air for years. To understand where Shaquille O'Neal is today, you have to go back to where he began, because the beginning never truly left him. He was born in 1972 in Newark, New Jersey, into a world that offered very little in the way of promises. His mother, Lucille, was 18 years old, barely an adult herself, raising a child in a city where survival required a particular kind of daily courage. His biological father made a choice early on, the kind of choice that echoes across decades. He walked away, and in doing so, he left behind a wound that no amount of fame, no quantity of championship rings, and no size of bank account would ever fully close. That wound became the engine of everything. The hunger to prove something to a man who was not watching. The desperate need to build something unbreakable in a world that had shown him, from his very first days, exactly how breakable things could be. What came next was the arrival of Sergeant Philip Harrison, the stepfather who entered the household with military discipline as his primary language. Philip Harrison was not a gentleman in the conventional sense. He was a man who believed that the only way to protect a boy as visibly large and therefore as visibly vulnerable as young Shaquille was to forge him in pressure. The warmth was there, buried beneath layers of demand and expectation, but it rarely surfaced in ways the boy could hold on to. What surfaced instead were standards, relentless, uncompromising standards, and a basketball handed over not as a toy but as a survival tool. The court became the one place where the teenager who stood 6 feet 8 inches at 13 and wore a size 17 shoe could stop being an anomaly and start being a force. He shot hoops in Germany while the European wind cut through his hands, and he did it largely in silence, searching the face of a stoic soldier for something that almost never came. Approval, a nod, some signal that he was enough. That signal was always just out of reach, and chasing it quietly shaped every competitive instinct he would ever have. By the time he entered the NBA in 1992, he was not simply a talented basketball player. He was a geological event. The Orlando Magic selected him first overall, and almost immediately the league's infrastructure began to fail under the weight of his ambition. He did not break backboards because he was careless. He broke them because the equipment was never designed to withstand something like him. In Phoenix, a steel stanchion collapsed entirely. In New Jersey, a fiberglass backboard shattered into pieces and rained down onto the hardwood floor like the remnants of something that had simply met its limit. The NBA eventually retrofitted its own arenas, re-engineered its own equipment, just to accommodate the fact that this man existed. If that does not tell you something about the scale of what he brought into the world, nothing will. The championships came in Los Angeles, 3 of them back-to-back beginning in the year 2000, alongside a teenage prodigy named Kobe Bryant, whose cold competitive stare matched Shaq's own hunger in ways that were both beautiful and ultimately destructive. They were, for a brief and brilliant window, the most unstoppable partnership professional basketball had ever assembled. 3 consecutive Finals MVP awards. A dynasty that made the purple and gold of the Los Angeles Lakers feel less like a team uniform and more like the flag of a conquering nation. But empires built on the collision of 2 enormous egos rarely survive their own success. The cracks formed quietly at first, in locker room silences, and carefully worded press conference answers. Then they widened. Then they became a fracture that no amount of winning could seal. In 2004, the franchise made its calculation and shipped Shaquille O'Neal to Miami. They traded a king because kings are expensive and youth is cheaper. He won a fourth championship in Florida. But something had already shifted. A chapter had ended that could not be reopened, and a partnership had broken that would take 15 years to even partially repair. There were other losses waiting, ones that cut far deeper than any trade. In 2013, within the span of a single devastating year, he buried two fathers. Philip Harrison, the man who handed him a basketball and built him into a warrior, died at 74. The discipline and the demand and the ironclad presence that had simultaneously suffocated and saved him was gone. And then, almost cruelly, the biological father who had walked away in the early years of his life attempted to return, drawn back by the gravity of the empire his abandoned son had built. Shaquille met that attempt with a wall of silence. But when that man died later the same year, alone and in poor health, the silence became something more complex. It became a question without an answer, a reckoning with the difference between resentment and regret, a realization that some doors close before you decide whether you wanted them open. He had built a family of his own during those Los Angeles years, marrying Shawnee Nelson in a ceremony that was as much a declaration of intent as it was a celebration. He was going to be different. He was going to be present. He was going to give his children what had been withheld from him. The 6 children in that household were not just family. They were proof, evidence that the cycle could be broken, that the ghost of absence could be laid to rest. But the very hunger that drove him to build that fortress also drove him away from it. The commercial shoots and the road trips and the relentless machinery of being Shaquille O'Neal consumed the hours that were supposed to belong to bedtime stories and birthday dinners. He was constructing an inheritance while inadvertently forfeiting the childhood that should have come with it. When the marriage dissolved in 2011 and the court awarded primary custody to Shawnee, the man who had promised himself he would never become his father stood on the courthouse steps and understood, with a clarity that no amount of wealth could soften, that he had become a version of the very thing he feared most, not through abandonment, but through distraction, not through cruelty, but through the negligence of greatness. The years that followed were years of a different kind of competition, not for trophies or titles, but for something harder to measure, redemption within his own family, relevance inside his own home. He found a large cultural footprint in television, his booming laugh filling living rooms through his work as an analyst, the persona of the jovial giant reassuring the public that everything was fine. But the public version of Shaquille O'Neal and the private version had been diverging for a long time, and by the mid-2010s the gap between them had become a canyon. Then January 2020 arrived, and the sky over Calabasas collapsed. Kobe Bryant was killed in a helicopter crash at 41 years old, along with his daughter Gianna and 7 others. In the years before that morning, Shaquille and Kobe had finally, painfully, found their way back to one another. They had sat together, laughed together, acknowledged the brotherhood beneath the rivalry. They had done the work of forgiveness that most people never attempt. And then fate granted them only months to enjoy what they had built before taking away in an instant at the Staples Center Memorial. The most physically imposing man in the building stood at a podium and broke completely. The voice that had shaken arenas could barely hold itself together. He was not performing grief. He was submerged in it. He was mourning a little brother, a partner in a shared world so elevated and so isolating that almost no one else could understand what it felt like to inhabit it. The public watched and saw a giant weeping. What they were actually seeing was a man realizing that the last person who truly understood his life was gone. And the body, the magnificent and brutal body that made all of it possible, was beginning to send its own message. Decades of professional athletics had extracted a price that no salary could offset. Every thunderous collision at the rim, every season of carrying 300 pounds of muscle across hardwood floors at full sprint, every year demanding more from his joints and his spine than any human frame was designed to give, had accumulated into a debt that was now coming due with interest. The hip pain became chronic, then severe, then surgical. The rehabilitation required to maintain basic daily mobility became its own full-time occupation. And when the relentless daily structure of professional training disappeared after his retirement in 2011, the body that had once been one of the most conditioned instruments in sports history began to expand in ways that alarmed the people closest to him. By 2021, his weight had climbed past 415 pounds. The man who had defined physical supremacy for a generation looked in the mirror and did not recognize what looked back. His doctors delivered the kind of news that reframes everything. Severe sleep apnea, a condition that was causing him to stop breathing more than 100 times every single night. Think about that number. 100 times. In the dark of his bedroom, in the silence of his estate, the body that had broken steel and shattered glass was quietly shutting itself down, night after night, while the championship ring sat cold and indifferent on the nightstand. No amount of money or fame or legacy can negotiate with a sleeping body that has forgotten how to breathe. The machine became part of the ritual. Every night before sleep, the CPAP mask goes on. The mechanical hiss of pressurized oxygen fills the room, and the most decorated center in basketball history closes his eyes dependent on technology just to make it to morning. He has spoken about this publicly, with a candor that costs him something each time, because the entire architecture of his public identity was built on the premise of invulnerability. Superman does not need a breathing machine, but Shaquille O'Neal does. And the distance between those two identities is where the real story of his life in 2026 actually lives. He fought back. That part needs to be said clearly, because the story is not one of surrender. Over the past 5 years, he stripped more than 55 pounds from his frame through a daily regimen that required the same stubborn will that once carried him through freezing German evenings shooting basketball until his hands went numb. He did not do it for cameras or endorsements. He did it because his children are watching. He did it because he made a promise. The same promise every father makes when the weight of absence finally becomes heavier than the weight of presence, that they would not be asked to bury him before his time. He had watched what the early death of a father does to children. He had lived it from the other side. He was not going to be that story. The financial empire is real, and it is staggering. A portfolio worth $500 million, encompassing fast food franchises and fitness centers and car washes, and investments that were made when most athletes were spending their earnings on things that disappear. He moves through the world in custom vehicles built to accommodate his frame. The laugh on television is genuine. The business acumen is formidable. But when the gates of his estate close behind him in the evening and the silence takes over, the currency that matters most is not in any account. It is in the phone calls from his children. It is in the slowly rebuilding bridges between a father and the adults his children have become, adults who grew up watching him be a brand more than they watched him be a presence. His son Sharif's heart surgery in 2018 was the moment when everything the body of Shaquille O'Neal had ever represented was permanently renegotiated. His son, a physical mirror of his own prime, lay on an operating table with a congenital heart defect, while the man who had been physically invincible for 30 years paced hospital corridors that were not built for his size, sitting in waiting room chairs that buckled slightly under his weight, completely and utterly powerless. He had built fortresses and smashed backboards and imposed his will on every environment he had ever entered. And in those operating room hours, he could not impose his will on anything at all. The surgery was successful, but Shaquille O'Neal walked out of that hospital a fundamentally different man than the one who walked in. The lesson was simple and devastating. There are rooms his size cannot enter and problems his money cannot solve. The sooner he accepted that, the more human he became. What is happening to Shaquille O'Neal right now is this. A man is meeting himself, perhaps for the first time, without the armor, without the persona, without the stadium crowd or the television cameras or the endorsement contract, providing a version of himself to inhabit. He wanders into ordinary stores in ordinary moments and pays for things that strangers cannot afford, then leaves before the gratitude arrives. Because he is not looking for gratitude. He is looking for the boy from Newark who is still somewhere inside the 54-year-old body. The boy who wanted a bicycle and knew there was no one to buy it. That boy never left. He just got buried under 30 years of magnitude. He is not the Superman he sold to the world. He is something more interesting and more honest than that. He is a man with shattered hips and a breathing machine and 4 championship rings, and a table too large for one person. trying to figure out how to be a father to children who are now adults, trying to honor the memory of a stepfather who gave him discipline and a biological father who gave him only a question mark, try and keep breathing in a body that spent 3 decades being treated like a weapon and is now demanding to be treated like a person. The world will remember the backboards. The world will remember the three-peat and the finals MVPs and the commercials and the movies and the laugh that could fill any room on earth. But the real monument to Shaquille O'Neal is not in any of that. It is in the daily decision to put on the mask and breathe. It is in the phone call to a child he once failed. It is in the 55 pounds of hard work motivated not by vanity, but by the simple, terrified desire to still be alive for people who need him. It is in the willingness to stand in front of a mirror at 54, wearing no championship ring and no camera-ready smile, and choose to try again. The heaviest thing Shaquille O'Neal ever lifted was not a defensive lineman. It was not a backboard. It was not even the weight of his own legend. The heaviest thing he ever lifted was the honest truth about who he had been, and the decision, quiet and unglamorous and deeply human, to become something better. That is not hard to watch. That is the most important thing any of us ever does.